Friends, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, and I want you to give a big round of applause for Rabbi Morley Feinstein and the staff of the University Synagogue. And a round of applause not only for the Board of Rabbi staff, but for Rabbi Miriam Glazer and Rabbi Ilana Grindblad, who put together this wonderful program, the committee for our One People, One Book program. So welcome again to One People, One Book, our Deaf Jew Poetry Slam. People have asked me in recent weeks, why poetry? From ancient psalms to modern slams, poetry tells the story of our people. The poetry of the Bible, from the Song of the Crossing of the Sea, the Song of Deborah, Tehillim, the Psalms, and Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, to the great medieval Jewish poetry, including the Piyutim, the poems that find their way into the holiday liturgy, and even erotic love poetry of medieval poets, to modern Hebrew and Yiddish poetry. Poetry, friends, is the essential feature of Jewish literature and indeed of Jewish life. In preparing for tonight's program, I found a couple of very interesting observations of poetry. The first from a poet named Frederick Smock, who wrote, "Poets and intellectuals who are paid little and who are usually ignored by the population have this consolation: at least they are the ones the tyrants go after first." Okay, that interesting observation. One I like a little better, a little more positive, is by a poet and author and professor of English literature at Middlebury College, Jay Perini, who wrote a book called Why Poetry Matters. And he writes, "Poetry doesn't matter to most people. Most people go about their business as usual, rarely consulting Shakespeare or Frost. One has to wonder if poetry has any place in the 21st century, when music videos and satellite television offer daunting competition for poems." But he continues, "The pressure of reality is indeed fierce, and yet poetry supplies a kind of counter-pressure, pushing back against external forces that would overwhelm and obliterate the individual. Poets give a voice to the world in ways previously unacknowledged. We listen to the still, small voice of poetry when we read a poem, and that voice stands in contrast to the clamor in the culture at large, and often to the sound of society's explosions." Good friends, we thank you for joining us here tonight. There will be no formal introductions, but after hearing the voices of so many great poets, many of whom tonight are reading their own original works, we hope you will lend your voice to the discussion. Following the poetry slam of the evening, we will be directly sliding from the slam into a poetry discussion, I didn't write this, into a poetry discussion about identity, based on two of the poems you will hear tonight. Yehuda Amichai's Names in Other Days and in Our Time, and Zelda's poem, Each of Us Has a Name. This year we're very pleased that One People, One Book, the Board of Rabbis' signature community learning program, features not just one book, but two books filled with exquisite poetry of two of Israel's most gifted poets, Yehuda Amichai and Zelda. They were both giants in their field, and through their work, they helped to shape Jewish identity and Israeli identity. I close again with the observation of Jay Perini, who writes, Poetry can make a difference in the lives of readers. Every morning, I begin the day with a book of poems I open at the breakfast table. I read a poem, perhaps two. I think about the poetry. I often make notes in my journal. The reading of the poems informs my day. It adds brightness to my step. It creates shades of feeling that formerly had been unavailable to me. In many cases, I remember lines, I remember whole passages that float in my head all day, snatches of songs, as it were. I firmly believe my life would be infinitely poorer without poetry, its music, its deep wisdom. And he concludes, I could not live without poetry, which has helped to shape my existence more concretely and more deeply. Poetry has shaped my thinking. It has enlivened my spirit. Poetry offers me ways to endure my life and even to enjoy my life. Good friends, without further ado, please join me in applauding One People, One Book, our Deaf Jew Poetry Slam.